Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Matchday 4 cheat sheet. Now, obviously, there are two different ways to go about planning your Matchday 4 strategy, and it really comes down to what chips you have left. Some people actually are in a very lucrative position where they've gone and kept all their chips. So maybe what you can do, obviously, is save your Matchday 4 wildcard as a free hit on Matchday 4, then you use Limitless in Matchday 5, then you wildcard on Matchday 6. Now, in my opinion, a lot more people are within the camp where they're actually only with the wild card left or have no chips at all. And I think once again, you have to be considering one very important thing. If you do not have a wild card, you should be considering making sure that you have an even amount of, in my opinion, of players from both sides of the bracket, at least in terms of trying to get players who are going to reach the semifinals. Because if anything, the way that the transfers work is that on match day 4, you've got a wild card effectively, right? A natural wild card. On match day 5, you will have 3 free transfers to actually adjust your team. So not too many, to be honest. So you probably still want to pick teams that ultimately will win their games. And unfortunately, the way the bracket has unfolded is teams like Spain and teams like Germany that actually have a really good chance to win this tournament, unfortunately, are facing off versus each other. So if you look at, for example, Opta and their sort of prediction of the Euro tournament so far, you will notice that it seems like England are the team that they project to be the winning team, which means that they do think that England will go all the way towards the finals right now as the most dominant team. However, teams like Spain, Germany, France, and Portugal are all on one side of the bracket. So it's actually tough to sort of conceptualize this, but actually when you look at the semifinal draw, it seems like just by prioritizing teams that will get to the semifinals, Netherlands, for example, is a very good team to potentially back as well. Teams like Austria as well, within England's side of the bracket, are also another team to target. Now, on that sort of Portugal, Spain, Germany side of the bracket, and France as well, the issue, of course, is if you pick, let's say, a lot of these players, unfortunately, you're dealing with that sort of 50-50, almost coin flip, really, of Spanish players getting knocked out, German players getting knocked out. And if you invest too heavily into them on match day 4, you might suffer a little bit without a wild card. Now, if you have a wild card, the reality is the fixtures on match day 4 are just amazing. So what I would say is try to consider your strategy first in terms of how many players you want from certain teams and what side of the bracket they're on before you jump into just picking the best players. Now, let's just jump into talking about picking the best players. As far as the best players to target starting from the midfield position, we don't have too many changes, but I think the main change, of course, is now in terms of moving from easier group stage fixtures, for example, for a team like Belgium. Belgium, unfortunately, have a super tough game versus France. So the stock of all the Belgian players have fallen. Germany, unfortunately, also have a pretty tough matchup when it comes down to it, right? Denmark is a pretty tough opponent. And I'd say the same case for, of course, France versus Belgium, the flip side. So you'd equate the same for the French players. And so as a result of that, we haven't had too many changes, but you can see that there are some budget options within the game. It's still Abisher and it's still Højbjerg. These are players who will still contribute no matter what. Højbjerg is someone that you would like to have, obviously, as a bit more of a DM. He's had man of the match performances before. His ball recoveries amongst all the midfielders in the game are actually really good. One thing that I'd actually like to point out that I've noticed within this tournament is that the ball recoveries for the midfielders compared to domestic league football is awful. For whatever reason, the ball recoveries do not seem to be accounted for correctly for the midfielders, and I really think that that should be taken out of our judgment and estimation, to be quite honest. And on top of that too, the center backs seem to have an even higher amount of ball recoveries than they ever do. So that's why ball recoveries are so much more important for the center backs compared to what we see in domestic football. So when I was showing you guys the ball recovery figures before the tournament started, it was actually very close between the midfielders and defenders. Now you can see a massive gap, and that's why so many of the midfielders now are in the red zone for ball recoveries per 90. And that's one thing I wanted to mention. Højbjerg, on the other hand, is still someone who's actually very good at getting ball recoveries. So I think he's very strong from that aspect. Now, as far as Abisher, unfortunately, he plays multiple different roles for Switzerland. We saw him play a little bit central in match day 1, and he had a man of the match performance. Unfortunately, man of the match actually went to Granit Xhaka, but he has been moved wide and he has obviously operated wide for Switzerland a couple of times. And so that's one of the issues with Abisher, and I think that's why he's only purely a budget pick. And I really do not suggest that you go there. As far as the 6 million price bracket, we finally have some good options. We've got Vitinha, who is your classic sort of controlling midfielder, plays a little bit deeper, but could get man of the match potential. We saw that in match day 1. He's obviously going to be much less creative, but he's playing for a Portugal team that have a really good matchup here versus Slovenia. And I still think that when you look at Vitinha, he's still cracking a lot of shots every game. Now, he hasn't really opened up his, let's say, international account per se, but I still think he's a very interesting player to have, particularly at that 6 million price point. And if you want to have, let's say, quadruple Portugal, I don't think that he's a bad option. However, I would still prefer, for example, the defensive options, Bruno and probably still Ronaldo. However, whether you back Ronaldo is also up to you. As far as Conte, I think he's a brilliant option, but clearly, of course, the ceiling, I suppose, is a little bit lower. What we have seen from Conte, however, is that he's also been pretty useful and pretty impactful on the offensive side of the game. So, for example, when I looked at Conte, for example, in match day 2, when Mbappe was out, we saw Conte, of course, create what could have been, let's say, a goal-scoring chance for Griezmann. And overall, of course, we've seen him in the attacking phase, even more so than, let's say, some of the other midfielders, right? Like, for example, Tchouaméni is practically just the DM for the team, whereas Rabiot and Conte actually get into really good attacking positions. So if France were to, let's say, step up their level of play, Conte can still get involved. And unfortunately, of course, they are versus a pretty tough Belgium opponent, but that could also be the type of game where Conte could get man of the match, right? The tougher games for France, I suppose, are also ones where we've seen him get man of the match. Now, they obviously drew versus Poland, but I think you get the general gist. As far as Granit Xhaka, I still think the fixture is actually quite good for Italy, because what we've seen from Switzerland and Italy in this tournament is that actually Switzerland are probably impressed a little bit more. However, it seems like Italy are still generally favored to advance within this tie. So when you're going for a Swiss player, of course, you sort of have to deal with that gamble. What's nice about Granit Xhaka is that he's been one of those players who clearly, if we're being honest, with the way man of the match is working, is with a lot of the Swiss players probably being less renowned players, it seems like Granit Xhaka is going to get man of the match or have a good good share of man of the match if Switzerland are to do well. So I think he's definitely one of the players to look at just simply from a price point perspective. But beyond that, not that interesting, given that he's not that attacking a player, which makes sense, of course, given his role for the team. At 6.5, I think we finally have some really good options. Sabitzer, for me, is my top option. He's got a really good matchup here. Turkey have been a really poor defense so far within this tournament. I think Sabitzer, although he didn't take penalties over, let's say, Arnautovic, and that was a bit of a shock to us, I think part of that is because I would still say that he's a penalty taker over someone like Gregoric, who I was actually expecting to have more minutes within the tournament. However, as things have unfolded, we've seen Arnautovic actually start the last 2 games for Austria, and that might change our conception of Sabitzer as a pick. However, what's been good for Sabitzer is that he's played incredible, man of the match for match day 3, and also just in general had really good minutes. One of my concerns with Sabitzer is what his minutes would be within this Austrian team. It seems like he's a player who I would say is essential to Ralf Rangnick's plans, and for that reason, I think he's definitely the best Austrian pick, even better than Baumgartner, who at one point I thought was an equal to Sabitzer. And I still think I would still hold Sabitzer a little bit higher in the regard because of the difference in terms of the minutes. As far as, let's say, the 6.5 bracket right below Sabitzer, I think we have a lot of close options, and they have a lot of different routes towards points. You've got Kroos, who is much more of a controlling option. He's more of a set piece threat, has probably one sort of long distance range shot on target per game. Fabian Ruiz is somewhat similar to that, right? Not on set pieces. However, he has been actually very excellent for Spain in this tournament specifically in carrying the ball into offensive positions, whilst Rodri stays a little bit back as part of that double pivot. So him and, let's say, Pedri almost move in a tandem at times within the offensive phase if Spain are dominating the game. And that's allowed Fabian Ruiz to advance into good positions and take good goal-scoring opportunities, which I like a lot. So that's been a huge improvement from Fabian Ruiz. Now, Rodri, in my opinion, as I said, with the ball recovery mechanic and how it works within the point scoring for UEFA, I think it's all over the place in the sense that the midfielders do not seem to be correctly accounted for when it comes to ball recoveries, and the center backs seem to get every ball recovery possible in a 50-50 situation. So for whatever's happening here, Rodri, in my opinion, sort of has to drop compared to our estimation, even though the fixture is so good for Spain. Also, if I was to quadruple up on Spain right now, I think because the price points are very kind, because there's not too many sort of mainline picks from, let's say, Belgium or even England midfield that we really need to go for, you probably don't need to stretch that budget so much to actually need to afford someone like Rodri as a price point. And that goes the same with Baumgartner as well. Really good fixture once again. I still like him a lot. I'd still just prefer, at the end of the day, Sabitzer, and I probably wouldn't double up on the Austrian mids just because there's so many options as well. Çalhanoğlu, I think he's got, unfortunately, the tougher end of the fixture. If I was to predict a team to advance, a team to do better in this game, I still think it'd be Austria, just from what I've seen all over the tournament, and that's sort of how I rest my case. As far as the 7 million price point, I think all three options, in my opinion, are amazing, and currently they're actually within my present draft. Nico Williams has proven to be an amazing player. He had his breakout game in match day 2 and then was rested fully within match day 3. So I think that's really nice from the sort of rest perspective and how many minutes he can contribute to the Georgia game if he absolutely needs to. Within, for example, the limited appearance within Italy, where of course he was subbed off at around 70-75 minutes, he was brilliant and he created a lot of chances. Could have got an assist, could have got a goal on a different day. And I just think the fact that he's that dynamic, that mobile for Spain, just makes him an excellent option to consider. And of course, he got player of the match as well for Spain. So something to think about is in terms of, you know, the quality of the play, the aesthetic of the play. Nico Williams definitely is sort of a man of the match winning potential player. As far as Gundo, we've seen obviously a lot of goal contributions from him so far. He is almost the opposite, right? That nothing when it comes to, let's say, the dribbling and the flair, which is more like Musiala within his own team, but someone who obviously is very direct, gets into great attacking positions in the box, and consistently appears in the right places that you'd want to have a player who can get goals and assists. And that's what Gundo did to get man of the match in day 2, or match day 2. And I do think that Gundo is still going to be a great pick. Yes, of course, slightly tougher fixture here versus Denmark, but still, if you were to, for example, look at some of the teams and the expectations of the goals, as I said, outside of Spain, Portugal, England, the next best team might still be a France, or let's say a Netherlands or a Germany. So I can totally understand backing an option from these teams instead. It doesn't seem like we expect Austria to score that much, just based on what I've seen from just sort of the team goal odds for, let's say, Austria versus Turkey. So on that basis, it's actually hard to justify going away from Gundo, in my opinion. I think Xavi Simons is actually really good as well. But just before we go on to that, Pedri, in my opinion, is an amazing pick. I think the fact that he was rested in match day 3 is essential. I also think, I have to be honest, even though Olmo had a good performance in match day 3, the reality is that he was versus Albania. And I do think the level of play that Pedri has shown so far within this tournament will sort of keep his minutes in a very good position. I think the fact that he got that rest, as I said, a full week and probably a couple of days of rest now for Spain, just means that both players like Williams and Pedri will probably get good minutes versus Georgia, unless of course the game is in a very good and healthy position for Spain. So I do like them. I've liked how many good opportunities Pedri has made. He's always been very close at multiple sort of chances in this tournament to score, and unfortunately he hasn't scored, but he has been very close to assisting. And I think his best opportunity that he actually created outside of the assist from Fabian Ruiz was the assist, or the potential assist, that he could have got on match day 1 for Lamine Yamal. So to me, I think Pedri has just been brilliant so far. Definitely someone that if you've been watching the games, you'd keep an open eye to. So I do like Pedri a lot. Xavi Simons, I think just because the fixture is a little bit tougher, and the fact that, in my opinion, unfortunately, the Dutch team just do not look that good for whatever reason. I think we probably had higher estimations for them in the tournament, and they've probably fallen a little bit short of that. And part of that, of course, if you've seen, for example, within press conferences, Koeman sort of admitted faults, for example, within the Austrian game, but also the minutes, for example, for players like Xavi Simons are always a little bit variable, right? He was actually about to, for example, score a goal in match day 2. In match day 3, he actually got the important assist at one point, right? Until they still eventually lost. But he's shown to be actually a player that, in my opinion, has been quite important to the Dutch team. And maybe there has been a shift in expectation of that, right? That sort of really poor performance and Xavi Simons stepping in match day 3 and having a decent game overall might mean that his minutes actually will improve as we go into the tournament. Maybe, of course, that's enough justification to sort of move away from, let's say, the template here with, let's say, players like Gundo. But once again, as I said, I'm not that high on the performances that Netherlands have shown so far, even though the matchup looks quite good on paper, which is obviously just Romania. Romania have actually been pretty brilliant so far in this tournament. Obviously, that group, you could argue, maybe is a little bit weaker than some of the others, but for the most part, of course, they've been impressive and pretty defensively resolute. So that's one thing to sort of point out. As far as the other players in 7 million, I just think the fixtures are too tough. Italy, of course, for Switzerland, with a much more deeper player. A central midfielder is just a bit boring in Barella. Kvaratskhelia, of course, brilliant performance in match day 3, man of the match winning performance, but once again, versus the Spain A team, I really don't think there's too much of a chance, unfortunately, for Georgia. And then with Eriksson, similar situation with Germany, unfortunately, where you're expecting, I think, him to probably have a little bit more of a diminished performance. Now, of course, Eriksson has been capable of winning the match, and he's done it twice already. So, of course, if ever Denmark could pull the upset, which it seems like it's pretty probable, right? Then, of course, Eriksson can be a good punt. But at 7 million, I think I'd still go and back players, or teams even, that are expected to do just that much better. With Wirtz, I still think he's a good pick, but once again, the minutes aren't so good compared to, let's say, Gundo Musiala. I've probably discussed this a couple times within my cheat sheet videos. I don't think my sentiments have really changed. He is a very lively player, but he's obviously usually the most likely replacement for someone like Sané. And for that reason, I think he's much more dull than, let's say, Gundo and Musiala at this moment in time. Musiala, obviously, as I said, with better minutes, and someone, in my opinion, who obviously has captured player of the match already, potentially also a bigger name, if we're being honest, when it comes to how player of the match is weighted. Definitely is someone who could actually be a little bit more interesting. I think Saka is also brilliant in the sense that England have a nice game. And if there's a player that you can sort of point out to who's been pretty consistent so far in terms of at least being able to unpack the defense a couple times, it is Saka. Although, of course, a lot of people still say that for the most part he struggled, as has the English team in general. Why I still rate Saka highly is because I think his position in the team is definitely a little bit more permanent. However, of course, his minutes are a little bit on the lower side. However, I just think because he's such a permanent fixture to this team, I just don't see Saka losing minutes, and I think the fixture is still good enough for him to be valued as a green-sided pick. With Bernardo Silva, I still think he's a differential. I still would definitely back Bruno. I think he's a little bit overpriced still, and I'd probably on most days pick Vitinha or Bruno over him. And even though he got player of the match, I don't think that really influences or changes my thoughts. And obviously that sort of covers off Bruno too, who in my opinion obviously is the main talisman of Portugal alongside Ronaldo. As far as Foden and Bellingham, I've got to be honest and say, they are almost part of that left side of England where there clearly are some issues, right? Trippier being a right-footed left back, Foden being someone who likes to drift inside, then forcing Bellingham to sort of play wide positions, which is exactly what happened in the previous match, isn't something that's aesthetically pleasing to see. And obviously, as a Bellingham fan from Real Madrid, it's not exactly how I'd like to see him be utilized, but this is the reality, right? That is a sort of struggle for England so far. We don't see any indications that Shaw will be back for matchday 4 necessarily, and I don't see him sort of necessarily being rushed either. So from this context and perspective, I'd probably still keep Foden and Bellingham a little bit below Saka for now, even though, of course, Bellingham just had a great game in matchday 1, and maybe I'm overreacting a little bit. But those are my thoughts, and I just think that, unfortunately, Bellingham isn't consistently getting into enough good position for England. As far as De Bruyne, unfortunately here, the matchup is just too tough, and once again, at that sort of 9.5 million price point, given that you can have access to players who are, obviously worse than De Bruyne, like for like, but ultimately with much more realistic opportunities to shine. And considering, of course, unfortunately, Belgium's once again really poor performance versus Ukraine being the sort of most recent sample size, I suppose, of what we've seen from Belgium so far, I've got to be honest and say De Bruyne just isn't an appetizing option for matchday 4. Now, moving on to the forwards, I think this is much more simpler. I think we can run through it very easily. Mikhail Tatse, of course, is the best budget pick, but whether you really need him, I think, is another question. I don't think it's necessarily the case, so I probably wouldn't look towards him. Keep in mind, of course, at matchday 4, you have a 105 million budget, so the need for, let's say, a 4 to 5 to 6 million enabler is pretty much non-existent. Yamal is the most interesting option at 6.5. You already have access to a player who, once again, in my opinion, is extremely creative and also someone who still has an eye for goal for the Spanish team. So I think he's obviously a dual threat. More so, of course, a little bit assist dominant than, let's say, goal dominant, but that's fine, just given the price point. I do like him a lot. Embolo for me is a little bit of a punt, right? You're looking at sort of a Switzerland sort of 65 minute appearance from Embolo where they could maybe surprise Italy. But I think Italy, if anything, we can give them credit for this tournament is that they have still looked like a very resolute defense. Now, obviously, they gave away a lot of chances to Spain, but I still think that they defended those chances well for the most part in terms of the shot stopping from Donnarumma, and then obviously a lot of still the individual work rate from the center backs you could see was very important for most of the games and how they were able to advance. But am I that confident in Italy? Not really. I still think Embolo is definitely a pick to look at. Arnautovic, I put an asterisk over him because I still think that it might be the case that Austria could rotate, right? We've seen Arnautovic start 2 games, but we've also seen, a preference for Greg Roach in previous games under Ralph Ragnick, and I'm not necessarily certain that I would say, his position in the team's completely lost. Arnautovic obviously also has reduced minutes as well as someone who's very prone to being a substitute. In the 7.5 million position, I think, the same logic applies to Havertz. Of course, his position is nailed in place, but Germany do have a tougher fixture versus Denmark, and I do think his minutes are susceptible. Now, with Denmark, of course, I think the interesting thing is with Havertz, right? Depending on the game state, it's more than likely that he actually gets to stay on if, let's say, Germany are losing. But obviously, if Germany are winning, or maybe, let's say, Havertz isn't, the flavor of the day, I suppose, for Nagelsmann, you still have other options within the squad that can bench Havertz. And so that's something to look forward to as well. And unfortunately, I think he didn't have the greatest of games, to be quite honest, versus Switzerland. He was quite muted. And even when I look at, for example, some of the goal odds for Havertz, despite being at the center forward for Germany, I don't see amazing dividends for him. I actually see better goal odds for players like Depay and Gakpo. The only issue that I would say with Depay and Gakpo is it's very hard to actually pick between the two of them. I think Gakpo has actually been more instrumental for the team so far, but as you can see, Depay is on things like free kicks, corners, and also scored a goal versus Austria as well, which probably would hopefully have lifted his confidence, but we're not in the business of sort of discussing the emotional element of players here. It's just about, you know, what we see so far. I think Depay obviously has a lot of routes towards points. Gakpo has obviously been a little bit more decisive in moments. His minutes are also a little bit better than Depay. I think both options are close. I think you'd only consider these options if you really want to have that sort of matchday 4 fallback captain. And those are my thoughts on those players. Morata, once again, for the similar logic to Yamal, just an amazing fixture. Obviously more goal dominant than assist dominant, but a very good pick all the same, and at a very good price point as well. Lukaku and Griezmann, both tough fixtures, not as key to their teams as, let's say, De Bruyne and Mbappe respectively, and therefore just not so interesting to me. With Ronaldo, Mbappe, and Kane, yes, of course, I think out of all three players, Kane has probably been the most boring by far. Ronaldo has actually had good chances, and Mbappe has mostly created a lot of chances when he's been on the pitch. And I think it just shows you how effective Mbappe is as a single entity within football nowadays. But he's just been brilliant, and I think Mbappe will continue to be a good pick, even though on paper, of course, it's not the best fixture for France, right? It's a pretty tough game versus Belgium, but Belgium have also flattered to deceive, and they've been pretty poor so far. So that performance versus Ukraine had plenty of chances, I think, to sort of open scoring versus Belgium, and obviously I still think France, of course, are a lot better, and therefore I think Mbappe is still a great pick. Ronaldo, obviously, with a good fixture here versus Slovenia, means that for me he's still an interesting pick. Obviously, Slovenia did actually keep a clean sheet last time out versus England, which is pretty impressive, but I'd still expect this Portuguese team to be a little bit more overwhelming, particularly when there are more stakes at play, or less stakes at play, in the sense that not every team is sort of playing for a draw, which is exactly what happened in Group C for whatever reason. And going back to it, explaining Kane, I think you just have to say at the end of the day, England do have a very nice preferential fixture, and the way that the tournament goes, of course, they have on paper a nice easy route towards the final in their side of the bracket. Now, they are the projected favorites to win this tournament. You might disagree with that based on watching England so far. I'd probably still back most of the defenders, but I also think that the issue that has come up through this tournament is that the English midfielders have all been pretty boring, and I still think that Kane, out of all the attackers, probably has the best projected minutes, and for that reason I'd still probably back Kane as someone who obviously from a sort of planning point of view is probably worth sort of holding on to until the end of the tournament. I'm sure at one point he will sort of have the green light to, you know, light things up if the chances do fall on his feet. And that's pretty much how I feel about Kane. I still think he's a good pick, but I can understand someone obviously moving away from Kane, feeling that he's been extremely boring. The XG has been really poor for England and for Kane, and that you'd like to move it to options like Morata, maybe the Dutch forwards as well. I think that's totally fine. In the defense, just to sort of walk through the defense, I think the best clean sheet odds once again fall to the teams with the best fixtures. Anyways, it's Portugal, it's England, and it's Spain. Now, in my opinion, because France have such a bad matchup, that's something to look forward to when it's specifically coming to defense. Italy, Donnarumma has been a great shot stopper, but for the most part, Italy, I think, have been pretty poor. For teams like, let's say, Austria, I think they've been strong on offense, but not necessarily, you know, that inspirational, I suppose, on defense. And outside of that, the other team probably that we'd say have been decent on defense so far have been Germany. And what I would say about Germany, of course, is that they unfortunately do have a pretty tough matchup, but they're still definitely a team to look at. Outside of that, I'd say a lot of the teams, it's hard to sort of believe that there will be clean sheet opportunities there, with exception to the Netherlands. But of course, we've seen so much rotation for the Dutch, and unfortunately, most of the options that are interesting are expensive sort of center backs. It's hard to justify whether you'd really want to back the Dutch unless you just want to have an even mix of two teams from both sides of the bracket. Now, starting from the 4 million price point, I think it's very simply Mittelstadt, who's actually a good pick. Faze, just because of the fixture, is just someone who I really wouldn't be intrigued by. The reality, of course, is we expect Germany to advance and Belgium not to, and that's why we sort of differentiated the players like so. Obviously, Faze has been really good about ball recovery so far. Guerki, I have to shout out as the best ball recovery sort of per 90 player so far within the Euros. You know, a market improvement from obviously his Crystal Palace numbers, which makes sense, right? These Crystal Palace numbers are influenced by Crystal Palace's style of play. You know, in this setup here where Stones is definitely playing a much more sort of laid back role for the team, Guerki we see as a much more attacking and aggressive player. And he's been getting a lot of ball recoveries per 90. For example, I would still go Guerki at this point, probably over all the other English defenders. With Lenormand, I think that it's been a bit of a weird situation where, of course, he came on at 45 minutes for Albania, so the sample size is small. But actually he's been pretty aggressive, I think. And compared to, let's say, Laporte, I would say he's definitely more aggressive between the two. And I think I'd project to think that his recovery per 90 numbers would actually go up going forward. So for me, I like Lenormand. I think he's at a ridiculous price point. Cucurella obviously is a weird one, right? He got 15 ball recoveries versus Italy. 15. However, that also means that he got one ball recovery versus Croatia. So it shows you how different the game can be game to game. But I think the most important thing that I'd mention as a Spanish player, or viewer rather, is that Laporte played in game 2, and we played a lot more through the left because of Laporte's left-footedness and his ability to move the ball immediately with an outswinging pass towards players like Cucurella and Nico Williams. So those two players, in my opinion, were unlocked in that game, specifically versus Italy. And it was also partially because of Laporte coming back into the team. Now, I don't think that's going to be, necessarily the case that we'll see 15 ball recoveries again in this tournament. I think that was a complete aberration. But it shows you, out of all the fullbacks, that Cucurella, in my opinion, has been very aggressive. And hopefully he can maintain it. And obviously at this price point, it's hard to sort of pass up on an option like him. With Schlotterbeck, he's definitely going to play for Germany because Jonathan Tah is suspended. We've talked about his ball recovery numbers previously. They were amazing. And, for someone who has a wild card in the back pocket, I don't really mind going Schlotterbeck, but at the same time, do you really want to go double Germany defense? I'm not so sure. Calafiori, definitely a good option. We saw a great assist in the previous match versus Croatia. Amazing ball recovery numbers, and obviously a slightly tougher fixture here. But at the same time, you can see he's also probably a little bit more of an instrumental player from the sort of attacking point of view as well, compared to most options at 4.5. So I think he's very interesting. At 5 million, it's just a preference here for the Portuguese players. Pepe, insane ball recovery numbers so far. Nuno Mendes, even as a fullback / center back in the games that he's played really well, and he's actually recovered quite a few. I think what you'll notice as well is a lot of the faster fullbacks are a little bit better at getting ball recoveries, just generally speaking. There's obviously some fullbacks who just don't even defend, right? Frimpong, for example, has been played mostly at the right wing position, so it's not like you're expecting ball recoveries there. As far as the center backs, as I said, Stones and DeMarco, a little bit poor, obviously. Laporte, quite high, but I think once again, small sample size, and I do expect Lenormand to get more ball recoveries going forwards. That's the relationship we saw within the Italy game. At 5.5 million, Walker, I think, pretty dull, pretty tame numbers for ball recoveries, but just because he's a part of the English defense, definitely still an option to look at. With Carvajal, good ball recovery numbers so far, and also a very attacking player in terms of sort of picking the right time to attack. He's not someone who's a consistent outlet, but I think he will always find a good opportunity within the game to create an instrumental play. Is he worth that additional million over Cucurella? I don't necessarily know, but I think obviously if you've got space for it, there's no reason to pass up on Carvajal. With Hernandez, unfortunately, poor ball recoveries, which is a bit odd, obviously, given the sort of pace dynamic I mentioned. But I think part of this, too, is because he does take very offensive positions for France. And the higher up you sort of play within an average position, the less you probably get ball recoveries. At the same time, too, you've got Conte as well supporting him. So that makes a huge difference. With Rudiger, really good ball recovery numbers, probably the best aerial threat within this German team. And ultimately, I think, has a tough fixture, but potentially, obviously, could go pretty far in this tournament as well. So I do like Rudiger as an option. With Ake, him, Dumfries, and Van Dijk, just to quickly talk about these three players, I think Ake and Van Dijk are most likely to play. We saw Dumfries get benched, but I'm not really sure that's going to be repeated. They probably have played better with Dumfries than better without. And ultimately, I think that Dumfries is a bit of a risk because, of course, the ball recovery numbers are not that amazing. And you can argue that his sort of attacking ventures, I think, have been a little bit more muted within this tournament. Part of that might just be the changing in dynamics on the right-hand side and the Dutch not really finding the right way, I suppose, to attack, although they still actually scored ultimately 2 goals versus Austria, which is promising. Mela, of course, just super tough fixture, so that's that. And then a 6 million price point, I think Trippier, it really just depends on whether you're wildcarding or not. You have to sort of pay attention towards the Shaw news. Van Dijk, I just think, has a slightly tougher fixture, and at 6 million is a little bit overpriced. Same goes for Ruben Diaz, even though the fixture is much better. He's unfortunately also not amazing at ball recovery, so that's a huge difference. And then Cancelo, I think, you've got a lot of good things going for you, right? Good recovery numbers, very offensive player as well for the team. But the question also needs to be asked whether I think he'd be preferred over Nuno Mendes. I think Nuno Mendes is still probably worth it just based on the 1 million cost saving that you can get. Now, quickly finalizing here with the goalkeepers, it's pretty simple. I think Pence is probably the best 4 million goalkeeper. Nita, unfortunately, with Romania, I'm not expecting too much. But of course, as I said, they could surprise, and the Dutch haven't been brilliant within this tournament. Verbruggen, on the other hand, I still think with good clean sheet odds, I would still rate him well as a 4.5 million goalkeeper. And then Pickford and Costa, I think, are the absolute steals. If you're on Pickford and Costa, you probably can stay on Pickford and Costa. That's probably going to be the most preferred goalkeeper pair so far. And then with Casteels, unfortunately, of course, the fixture is so tough for the Belgians that I'm not expecting much from him. With players like Simon, Magnan and Donnarumma. You know, Simon obviously is the most interesting pick. Unai, obviously with Spain, has to be on, unfortunately, the tough side of the bracket. But I still think that Spain actually probably had the best chances, and that's sort of what's backed by, let's say, Opta's predictive tool. They expect Spain to be sort of the second favorites to potentially win the entire championships and get out of that extremely tough side of the bracket. But of course, that comes at a cost, and the fact that there are other Spanish defenders at 4.5 million should probably beg you to question whether you want to spend the 5.5 million there. And really, that same sort of logic applies to 5.5 to 6 million goalkeepers. I don't think I need to say too much more about it. I will say that Donnarumma has been an amazing shot stopper so far, and that's been sort of reflected as well within some of the numbers in the tournament, but also just domestically as well this season. And that's it. That's the Matchday 4 cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the tournament, are enjoying the game so far. See you guys, and goodbye.